grasp on, for example, like elementary mathematics, things like that, elementary grammar skills. A lot of these things are just generally important for the rest of their life. So we think it's important that they learn these things well. Secondly, we also think it's important to enrich the skills that children already have. A lot of kids can do a lot of amazing things. We think it's important that we get their value, or we get their more of goal or passion towards learning and enrich this into something that can become useful and just generally help them grow within these directions, right? But thirdly, and also importantly, we think it's also important for them to be able to develop social skills and to interact with other children, interact with other age groups and other individuals. We think these kinds of things are important to establish and develop from a very young age. Second point, why then do we think the current model of education is extremely bad because of the fact that it's arbitrary? A few reasons. Before I move on, let's take that POI from opening.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, if a fifth grader passes the assessment at the start of the year with flying colors, are you willing to give them a high school diploma?
We're probably not going to be just immediately giving people high school diplomas, but it probably means we are willing to give them or have them opt into much higher level classes, right? More on that later, because I'm sure OO is going to run something on people being in radically different age groups. I have something on that later in my speech. I'll flag it. So second point, why then is this current model bad? And we think it's bad for a few reasons, but mainly all of these tied to the fact that age is incredibly arbitrary. So first thing, the fact that age is just generally not a reliable or consistent metric for competency. We think even if you look at things like science, sure, they might have a few things like, oh, these are general phases we expect children to like go through within their development. We still think a lot of these things are extremely vague and arbitrary, i.e. a lot of people just throughout science acknowledge that no children are going to check off a certain list of competencies throughout specific ages, and oftentimes these milestones vary a lot between child from child, right? Secondly, we think that the fact that it's incredibly arbitrary and that you can't ensure children of the same age can have the exact same competencies just because they're the same age oftentimes means that logistically it's incredibly hard to prepare or develop some kind of education plan or curriculum for these kinds of children. The fact that the children within each class have a wide array of skills, it's incredibly difficult to predict what they might be good at, what they might be bad at. Meaning the point in time for teachers who have to work on these things, they have to do things like learning how to adjust their pace and trying to figure out if they have to move these classes slower or faster. And the problem with this is when the pace varies significantly between the needs of different children, oftentimes this forces teachers to be put in a difficult situation of forcing a trade-off, i.e. they recognize one or two kids still don't completely understand the topic, but they're forced to move on in order to be able to introduce this topic to the vast majority of other kids within the class who need to learn these other parts of math, right? We think this is an incredibly difficult decision and incredibly difficult for children and like the education system in general to prepare for all of these different kinds of kids, right? But thirdly, we think this arbitrary system is incredibly bad because in the majority of cases, children are incredibly harmed by the system. Two reasons, or at least like two sub-levels. Firstly, on the children who tend to underperform, we think these children are oftentimes going to be left behind. This is bad because oftentimes they are left behind for a standard that is completely unfair and arbitrary. We think oftentimes this looks like them struggling to understand certain things, and we think oftentimes because they're comparing themselves to an unfair standard, it ends up in things like comparing themselves to other children for not having skills that honestly isn't even their fault that they don't have yet. We think that these kinds of things oftentimes relate and result into feelings of isolation and bullying. Children feel that you should be able to do these kinds of things because we are the same age. You cannot do these things. Therefore, I'm going to treat you worse. Therefore, I'm going to make fun of you. I'm going to isolate you. We think this is also often worse for kids who go through things like failing certain classes or being forced to repeat, because we think oftentimes this stunts their ability to socialize because now they're comparing themselves to other children. Now they feel because they cannot do certain things, it stunts their ability to socialize and be able to make friends with other children. But secondly, on the idea of advanced children, we also think these children are generally harmed by the system because they are now understimulated. They want to learn more advanced things, but they are forced to not learn these things because they have to slow down in order to wait for the rest of the class to catch up. Oftentimes, this forces them to do other things to stimulate their brain, things like acting out, rebelling. We think oftentimes these things also stunt their social skills because they feel they are unable to relate to and talk to their classmates. Why then is government model incredibly good? A few reasons. Number one, it's incredibly equitable. We give students the kinds of help that they need, irrelevant to what their age might be. Secondly, we think generally it's just more efficient. It's easier to plan out the planning and the pacing when you have a general grasp or you're ensuring that the children within a singular class have around the same level of competencies. So it means that the pace isn't going to be drastically changed between different students. It also means that you're less likely going to do things like forcing a trade-off and leaving students behind. Thirdly, we also think that it just generally, it makes it much better for you to develop social skills because number one, you're with people of likewise competency. So you're not going to compare yourself and you're not going to feel bad if you struggle with certain things because likely the other people within your class are also struggling within these certain things, right? But secondly, you also reduce the age expectation that comes with certain competencies. Because we think that the status quo, the reason why people feel bad about being delayed or about things like that is because in status quo, we tie these certain competencies towards your age. So i.e. if you aren't able to do certain things by a certain age, you feel bad. We think that this kind of reason doesn't exist on our side. Because opposition might say that, oh, you'll feel bad if you're like delayed and you're stuck with much younger kids. We tell you that the reason for you to feel bad probably isn't going to exist, because most classes within this system are likely going to be made up of a bunch of mixed ages. So probably your entire life, you're always going to have people who are a little bit younger than you, a little bit older than you. We think this is also a more accurate representation of reality. And we think even on our worst case, where you're like a 10-year-old and you're stuck in the class of 2 to 6-year-olds, we think if you're that like delayed, you're probably going to get bullied either way. At least on our side, this bullying is vastly reduced. All of these reasons, incredibly proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for the fine speech. Now I to invite the leader of opposition.
Hello, POIs through chat. I'll take one of the 5th minute. Okay. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I agree that it's important to cater to the needs of these students and those who are likely going to be the future of general society. But we don't agree that the way in which we do this is that we abandon the current systems that often allow individuals to have the most opportunities and to maximize a lot of their potential, given the fact that we group them by age in contrast to their competence. Because what changes on our side of the house is the ability to ensure that we also take into consideration the social competency of students, unlike to just simply take into consideration their academic prowess or might, which is most likely going to be the most harmful factor that PM provided to you in their speech. It's the model that came from PM is that this is a skill-based evaluation, but it's untrue that school only measures your ability to be good at test taking or to be ensured that you have the ability to comprehend complex topics, but also it means that the academic system also ensures a holistic capability to create a better child that can socially be inept enough to access many of the opportunities that they're likely going to get. Integrated my responses within the 2 arguments that I want to provide. 1, firstly, why does age matter a lot in terms of socialization? And this is something that you can find more importantly on opposition bench. I think in the mechanisms of socialization as to 1, bullying is likely going to be something that they have to go against or mitigate on their side of the house, or something that is a big problem, given the fact that age provides you certain forms of power imbalances. Physical bullying is something that is difficult to attune to and difficult to see, given the fact that sometimes 5th graders are less likely going to be larger physically than high school students that they're likely going to interact with. And these are the power imbalances that are difficult to monitor and most likely going to ensure that there are cliques, and that worsens a lot of the cliques that already happens in high school, or even when you're talking about middle school in general. But secondly, we also need to take into consideration the culture in which these cliques happen, given the fact that these socializations also takes into consideration what media they're likely going to access, what relationships they're going to foster. But lastly, it also means that we don't have the ability as a school to ensure that we provide soft and hard skills that you learn through peers and controlled environments that often is related towards the age that you have, given that's just generally how the human brain works. Your cognitive development is just attuned towards the way in which you socialize and perceive the world in which you operate in. Firstly, I want to propose an impact why socialization is likely going to be difficult, because it's just generally untrue that children bond over competency. I think children bond over things such as like aspirations towards general imagination, or the way that they play or do other activities apart from just simply studying. You can look down upon a 13-year-old still taking grade school level math, and this is likely going to be the bullying that is much more likely going to be worse on their side of the house, given the fact that this is something that is prominent and most likely going to be something that is normalized in their world. But secondly, it also means that 13-year-olds can be exposed to relationships with 17 to 18-year-olds, which is bad for their cognitive development, given the fact that it's difficult to understand just general societal relationships and the boundaries that you're likely going to set. This is what you learn in grade school, which is what your teacher teacher teaches you like common social values that you're likely going to have. But lastly, it also means that in terms of general interest, it does not fit with these social cultures that are built by the majority age group. If probably you want to play in the sandbox, but older kids might want to go to the mall or social hubs that they're likely going to build, which is much more difficult on your side of the end. But social activities and clubs might not be good for you. But even then, the parental and individual pressure to ensure that you are likely going to be a great child that can have immense amounts of intelligence and competency creates many more mental health issues. That's why child geniuses have the higher rates of rebellion and ability to not necessarily form their identities quite well, given that they often pander towards parental and social pressures instead of just being a kid that can play in the sandbox. Therefore, but before moving on, I'll take that POI from OG.
Some kids are going to be out of your maturity level. Same reason some kids are also going to be within your maturity level. Why can't I just hang out with the kids my age or close to my age?
Look, I know that we most often want to romanticize the relationships of different fluctuating ages, but the gap in terms of socialization is very big when you're talking about the difference between a grade schooler and a high school student. That's just generally a fact that we all have to have. PM herself said that fluctuations happen, but it's not often. So therefore, there's still an average age range that you're going to have. And therefore, that's why these social problems are more prominent. And PM argues themselves that being delayed is inherently harmful. That's why they don't like the comparative coming from opposition. But that's much worse on your side of the house when this is something that we do encourage as a society to ensure that we delay certain individuals, given the fact that they don't meet certain criteria of competence and intelligence, given that this is something that fluctuates or differs between different child. You might be good at mathematics, but you're bad in terms of the ability for you to understand languages. So there's a disparity and more difficulty to ensure that we match certain children towards the ability for them to be able to create that environment that is much more controlled and much more better for their cognitive and socialization development. But second, I also want to tackle in terms of teaching that we have on our side of the house, because teaching is not just simply you giving material and knowledge towards your students. Teaching is also a form of skill that takes into consideration their cognitive development, that is biologically linked towards the ability for you to understand skills and complexity. Understand that in early ages, you're more malleable to understand languages, but not necessarily mathematics, even given the fact that you don't necessarily have the attuned skills and complexity to understand the way in which an adult might try to like talk to you about it. But even then, teens have more access to things like public information, the access to public libraries, and even the internet that children often don't have, given the restrictions that we place on top of everybody else. Therefore, it's difficult to assess a teaching style. Therefore, what happens on government bench is that you don't necessarily fully develop individuals holistically. Sure, they may advance in terms of levels, but we foster a culture that necessarily leaves kids behind. That's reason as to why in age-based societies, we often offer things like remedial classes, more initiatives, the narrative that it's not their fault, given the fact that you might have familial problems or health issues that may deem you incompetent, given the performance-based model coming from prime minister. In government's world, this is a more punitive educational structure that punishes you, given the fact that competency and intelligence might fluctuate to uncontrollable variables. But on our side of the house, given the fact that we put a premium on the ability for children to catch up, we foster that cultures that we don't necessarily want to leave kids behind. So therefore, we offer additional support and additional advances to them. And this is the variability and complexity on towards difficulty on how we teach children is much more worse on their side of the house. So in two fronts, we win in terms of skills, but also we win on another front on socialization in the world of opposition. Vote for OO.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. Now to invite Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello, just a check, am I audible? Okay, great. I'll just get some water first in a second. Okay. Pronoun she, her, POI, 3 boys, just some badger. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I have a couple of clarifications before my substantive. Firstly, regarding the question of why does this motion actually exist in the first place? When we come to think about it, the idea of education is something that's fundamental for children, but the idea then is that what's most important for these children to actually understand the things that they're learning, giving you the fundamentals for them to actually have, let's say, a good job in the future. The things then that you ought to then think about in this debate is what are the things that are likely to cause people to not be able to actually be in the same age range or understand things the same age range that they are. I think there are multiple factors. But firstly, there's kind of like differing external factors like your financial status, social or financial, like or social or familial statuses as well. The idea is that there are lots of other kinds of reasons why these students aren't able to understand things properly or why they understand things a bit slower. But also the second factor, which can look like things such as understanding, speed, or capacity. There are also things that are heavily overlooked in opposition's world. Why is this true? One thing that was not necessarily that wasn't responded to by OO is the idea and the problem of the reason why these problems actually exist, which is the fact that they aren't able to be given the kind of education that is most applicable to them. That's the reason why matcha substantives are extremely important. But the idea then that you then have to think about is about how are we able to actually be able to show these people and show the education system what are the fundamental needs for these students to be able to learn something most effectively and properly. That is by their ability to actually be seen and actually be like heard of, because they're forced to think about how like their kinds of intelligence statuses as well. The idea that's like to happen on our side and how our paradigm actually works is that sure, maybe there might be people who are older who are left back or people who are younger who are left forward. What this actually means in our side is then that these people are able to show their abilities, how they're able to show what capacities they have, only mean to say that it's on our side exclusivity that you're able to then highlight how these people are able to learn, highlight how these people need to be taught, and with that, that's how we're able to accentuate the needs that they need as students. Why is it already like ultimately winning on our side, coming from what Matcha told you earlier? Is because one, no matter how much opening opposition wants to hammer down how things such as social factors are important, you have to note that firstly, this is an educational system, meaning to say the number one priority of these kinds of students and these parents and even the institution themselves is for these students to get the best quality of education. Note that on their side, they don't actually assess this problem. They already fall in this debate. I'll go then to my substantive, firstly on the individual level. How are we able to give these students the best opportunity for them to learn learn from the maximum utility? I think that's firstly on what Matcha told you earlier of how we're able to already maximize their ability to get the best kinds of materials and resources by the teachers who are able to focus on their level. That means to say that they're able to give them additional or advanced material if they show to have like specific intelligence skills, or if they're going to be slower than what is like the average for their age group and what's likely to happen opposition side. On our side, that's something that's unlikely to happen because then we actually show how these students are able to get the most amount of like education possible and the best quality as well. But also note that what's likely to happen on this kind of level on opposition side is things such as remedial classes or things like that. I think overall that doesn't necessarily benefit the problem or doesn't necessarily fix the problem because they only get stuck or give you more ammo and get bullied or isolated and things like that. And overall, just them wanting to give up in school, which overall just tries to shoot them on the foot. But overall, right, I think it's extremely important for you to also note how we're able to boost their ability to also want to learn as well. We think that something is likely to happen on our side. Why is this so? The number one thing that these students oftentimes have to think about or oftentimes want to feel the most guilty about is the idea of them being compared to their peers. What's likely to happen on opposition side is that they'll always be put into a scenario where there's likely to be people who are better than them, and meaning to say that's also likely to be that they're going to feel a lot worse about themselves when they're constantly pit against these people, when they can constantly see these people doing better and better, but no matter how much effort they put into their studies, they won't understand things to the certain degree as they will. This is something that's likely to ultimately happen over and over again over a prolonged amount of time because you're forever stuck into this kind of age group. But when our side, when we allow these people to actually go further, let's say go into a like also be able to see that they can go like they can also be put into a pace which is much better than them, it actually motivates these children to think about more about their individual ability to learn. But also secondly, it's also about how they're likely to actually want to like stay into education much further because they're able to also see how their ability to have intelligence or their ability to learn is something that can actually be beneficial to them. But further from that, right, it's also about how even if they're going to be able to, let's say they learn into a faster pace, it's also about how there's an even more rewarding system once they are able to go into a class of that's higher or more advanced, because that allows them to feel a lot better about themselves. I just noticed so many POIs in chat. I said voice, but yeah, I'll take from closing.
Why is it okay in your side of the house for a class with predominantly low SCS kids to be consistently competing against richer people that just look down on them?
We're not necessarily saying that they're going to compete with the richer kids. I'm not sure where you got that from our speeches. The idea is that from what Matcha told you earlier, our entire paradigm is about how we're going to get people to to literally see how their intellectual abilities can actually force them to be able to learn at a speed that's much more fitting for them. But overall, right, I think that's the second thing as well that I want to also add in my substantive is about how are we able to actually get the most understanding for these types of children. I think there are two reasons. Firstly, in the ability for them to be in a classroom where there's teachers can already help them into the level that they need. But also secondly, it's about how you're able to focus on these children of what I already told you earlier. When we tell you that there are people who look like they're lagging behind, this only accentuates them. It already brings out the problem further and it makes teachers be more concerned for their students. Only mean to say that on our side that you're able to get the most amount of attention for the people that need it. But the next thing I also want to talk about is already engaging what opposition told you earlier, which about what is like to happen on our side when you see a large diversification of ages. When they tell you about how people have different maturity and therefore it's a bad thing, I think they're extremely one-sided looking at this. Why is this so? I think that firstly, if they want to shield people into only working with people in their own age gaps, it only means to say that they're going to be terribly terrified when they go out to the real world because the real world already works between people from different age groups. So it's not necessarily something that's completely new into the world. The only thing that we'd like to do on our side is bring these things closer to your ages and closer to the education system, meaning to say that people are likely to be able to learn to work with other people from different age groups into a far easier way. It means to say that these people are likely to get different kinds of perspectives, different and more diverse kinds of discourse, because you're able to see people from different perspectives be able to talk and interact with each other. Overall, that's the idea why the sociability also goes up. But overall, note that opposition has no substantives regarding the ability to actually provide the best amount of education systems for all these reasons. Side with proposition. Thank you.
Thank you for the invite deputy leader of opposition.
Sorry, can I confirm? When the chair was just speaking, it was very laggy for me. So is it a me problem or is it a chair problem?
Yeah, I was like,
It's a chair problem.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can turn off my camera so that might help with the Wi-Fi. Can I just confirm if the chair can hear me properly?
Really? Sorry, my bad.
Okay. Am I clear already to the chair?
Yeah, you all are loud and clear. If it's my issue, then I'll off my camera also lah. But anyhow, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank
Yeah,
you so
you
much.
are.
Okay. Starting my
Yeah,
speech.
you're loud and clear.
Oof.
Yeah.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So let me just clarify what the debate is about, and then I'll do responses at the end. So when we're talking about curriculums on a national level, it isn't enough to say that there are some kids that are left behind when we're talking about a blanket policy that affects everybody that will go through our nation's educational system. So we must cater to the average student and create mechanisms which cater towards the exceptions for people that fall out of the norm. So let's clarify what status quo looks like. It is the counterfactual that we were defending. It was very clear coming from LO. And how does it cater to the average student that is determined by age? So we understand that in terms of intelligence, age is arbitrary and isn't the best determinant of that, but there are other factors which is it is a great determinant of. But then we'll talk about that later. But then if there are individuals who fall out of the norm when it comes towards cognitive development, intelligence, and competence, there are exceptions which cater to them already. We have things like AP and remedial classes for the dumber and smarter kids. We have smart summer school and shooters, which means to say that if your current level of schooling isn't sufficient for you to reach the level of education that you need, there are supplement classes that are available even within public school systems that are already the norm. The second thing is, if the only problem was that there are different individuals that need to learn at different paces, they don't necessarily prove why this has to happen at an entire school level that includes all of the grades and all of the ages. But I don't understand why academic sorting within specific age ranges cannot simply exist. Take note that this is the norm for a lot of schools already. So it's why this gradual change is necessary and why the delta and urgency to change the school system is required isn't something that's quite clear from OG. So this clarification deals with people being left behind because exceptions to the norm are already treated specially and have mechanisms to treat them. But two, pacing won't matter to the same degree simply because we are catering to the average. So, why is age-based grouping more suited towards catering to the average student? Take note, I will be responding, but I'll be doing it at the end. So we agree that age is arbitrary in terms of intelligence. However, age is not the sole determinant, but it is a relatively strong determinant of a few things that are important considerations when designing school curriculums. The first is in terms of physical and biological development, how tall and relatively strong you are, and what stage of physical development your brain is in, which caters towards what types of activities you can do in classes and what types of activities are better suited to this level of development. Take note that when you are younger, it is important that you practice and train your brain through repetition. But when you're older, it's important that you go through more complex problems and solve them. And that's why these problems often get harder. Take note that it isn't just we get harder lessons, but whether or not the addition problems that we have are shorter and therefore require a lot of repetition, or whether or not the algebra problems that we have are more complex, or whether or not we're given a lot more of these algebra problems. So it is based off of your cognitive development. Whether or not your physical development caters allows you to be in the same room as these first graders, and whether or not bullying is likely to be rampant. Second, it is also a strong determinant of social norms that are associated with age. Freedoms to interact with other kids, whether or not parents will pull you out because you're shown diagrams of the human body before they determine that you are ready to see these images. The tolerance of behaviors that impact classroom learning, like, for example, your need to take naps or getting distracted more easily because you are more perceptive to the world around you and therefore have a harder time sitting down and listening to classes. All of these social norms determine whether or not and how these curriculums are designed and how teachers teach as well. It's not just about intelligence. Thirdly, what it also determines the people that you interact with. Who was at the park at the same time as you because they were at the same level of physical and cognitive development? Who did your parents choose to befriend because they had kids at the same time as them? So it is not a sole determinant of intelligence, but it is the sole determinant of many other things which are important considerations for children, which must be taken into account when designing a curriculum. So why are curriculums designed with more than intelligence in mind, and why does taking into account age an important factor than therefore? One, it is a sole determinant of the level of freedoms that kids their age often can handle. Can they access the internet for research? Or is screen time still bad for their attention span? Are they still sensitive to possible content within the internet, and therefore research projects and more complex classes may not be suited for them? That means that their activities and homework that they are given, or even their school projects, are determined by their age. And it's very difficult for us to have a blanket policy just because they passed written assessments. So that means that it may not be safe for them to visit local institutions through field trips, like businesses or public libraries. Two, we have to take into account the level of cognitive development that is determined by their age, how much they've eaten, how much time their brain has had to develop because of the nutrients they've been given. So, must they be allowed to make mistakes by using pencils because their level of cognitive development is more suited to that? Or is the stage of psychosocial development important to develop confidence through the use of a more permanent pen? Must their competencies be drilled through repetition or through harder problems? Thirdly, it also determines things like parental tolerance, the determinant of whether or not parents keep their kids in school, or whether or not they're forced to homeschool or forced to go to private schools simply because they don't agree that their kids should be shown diagrams of the human body at this age, or whether or not they are afraid of sending their kids to public schools because not only are they afraid of school shooters, they know that their first grader son is going to be in the same class as that high school aged boy that could be bullying them. Before I move on, any POIs? OG.
All your harms go by a blanket statement, which allow you to say that like things like kids won't be able to get ready for higher competency levels. But if kids have such radically different competencies, they won't like to be grouped together. So why is your harm likely to happen if it's just and essentially just justify your blanket policy?
Okay, yeah, that's the point. We're supposed to be talking about blanket policies because we're talking about the average student. Because most students went through the same education, have the same levels of psychosocial development, have the same level of physical development, they're likely to be very similar in terms of intelligence. So the people that you cater to toward on your side of the house are the exceptions to the norm. Catering, basing things based off of age is us basing things on the average, which should be the sole consideration when talking about curriculums. So there's more certainty that curriculums cater to the needs that vary based on age, and there's more certainty on our side in learning because you go through every grades. On Gov, you go skips through certain classes, and the classes cater towards ages that don't match you. But the responses that I promised. The first is in terms of pacing. One, this isn't that big of a problem because it is determined by the average. So the delta isn't that big because it's not limited by the smartest and the dumbest kids. Classes are dictated by the average that is close to their level of intelligence, whether they are smarter or dumber than the average, so the delta isn't that large. But also you have access towards existing mechanisms when you don't fall into the norm as well. I don't understand why academic sorting within age ranges aren't enough. I don't understand why AP classes or even remedial classes aren't enough to cater towards these individuals. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that fine speech. That concludes the opening half. Now I'd like to invite the closing half. My God, this internet. With that being said, member of Gov. Hello, member of Gov.
Hi, am I visible, audible?
Where are you? All right, yeah, you're loud and clear.
Okay, cool. Should I off my camera or what is better?
To be honest, I've been hearing your speech clear. So if I'm lagging, it's my internet. So I'm not sure what's the issue, but I think it doesn't have any
Yeah.
delta to it. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm off my camera, it's fine. All right. I'll take POIs preferably from closing. If none, then I'll take a POI from all. Please do POI me by the chat. I'll take you around 5 minutes or so. Yeah. So just arranging my notes. Oops, where's it? Paper. Oh, sorry. One, two. All right. Paper's fine. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Growing up, people used to tell me that life is a race. I think it's about time we change that principle and tell people why life is actually a marathon and you can take how much time you need in so far you're able to reach your goals and what you want to achieve as a whole. First thing I want to show you up chat why CG comes in differently from OG. CG is going to tell you why we actually changed norms because although OG tells you that they also want to change norms, there's no real mechanization as to how the norms exactly change beyond the life of school. We'll show you how, if insofar we can prove why this policy is key, it will also lead to a domino effect of how you change norms within like what happens for the students upon them graduating. And I think this is key to the debate because true that like students need to study well, but the reason why they need to study well in the first place is in order to get good jobs, to get a good lifestyle in the future, and that's something CG will show you why we secure. I'll integrate my responses to OO within my speech, but I just want to go through like this a few a few key training rebuttals first. Firstly, OO tells you that different age levels, like different ages have different levels of freedoms. This is true, but that's the problem, right? Like we need to change this, the idea that how different ages have different freedoms, because notice that the freedoms only given by your ability to be mature and how you accept these things. The point at which you don't change this norm is when people are ignorant that maybe certain 12-year-olds already know things like sex education, but they are just consuming it with no like real reformation by education systems to really cater on how they receive those messages, right? The problem right now in ops world is that people ignore the power of the internet. Notice how the internet is already a free space and there's no mitigation. Hence why you need to ensure that students have some like we need to ensure that students or just children generally are able to receive the information by the internet in a proper and safe space. It happens in our world because now we understand that even if you're a 10-year-old, you might already know and have access to all this information, and you might already be more mature than a certain 13-year-old who's under the rock, right? That means to say is how you protect the 10-year-old from thinking of things differently. In our side, we say no, you need change because in our side, you at least get things like better enforcement on social media, and you create better safe spaces that ensures like social media companies do create policies that is fair no matter the age group, but literally about the ability of how the average reasonable user will get the information and how they will perceive it. That's why even debates like beyond the array of ages, right? Like a certain 18-year-old can win the can win WDC tomorrow, but maybe even at 23 you are unable to do so. It's like unfair to discredit the 18-year-old. I think that our side we actually respect the 18-year-old, but we also have an incentive to teach the 18-year-old as what they deserve and not just for their certain age. But secondly, they talk to us about parental skill. I'm going to flip this argument and show you why we get better parental skill on our side. Because at least in our world, parents actually know their children better, and you don't assume that your 12-year-old is the same as every other 12-year-old. It's very different, right? You are able to actually assess how your child is like and actually talk to them. What do we get beneficial from this? A, it's easy to communicate to your child because you know the level of maturity and you expect this. In ops world, you ignore that level of maturity because notice how parents don't even really notice like how well you do in school because they always assume like, you're in the same class as your neighbor's 12-year-old friend. Maybe your level of maturity is the same. No, it's different, right? At least in our world, you take your time to actually assess your child because your child is a random 12-year-old in a class filled with 13 and 14-year-olds. That means to already show you to some extent your maturity is different. You can communicate with them differently. But secondly, beyond this, right, like the ability to for your child's like you understand your child's ability and interest better. That means you become a smarter, like a better parent in just knowing how you cater those messages of education towards them. Going to my first unique extension, then I want to push the extension as early. First, the extension is pretty simple. We want to run the principle of life is a marathon, right? Because like even in today's world, like after upon graduation, when you by a certain age in status quo, right, you need to achieve certain things. I.e., like by 25 years old, you need to graduate from university. By 30 years old, you need to be married. Otherwise, you like society just like demeans you or like thinks you're a failure. This pressure is literally created by the current system in status quo, the one that Ob is defending. Hence why we need to show to break the system down. Firstly, why is the status quo principle this detrimental? First, the system is bad because like you ignore people's differentiality, right? By reasons like they are just different victims of bird lottery. Some are winners, some are losers of the bird lottery. But second, you also ignore how life is volatile. Different people have different journeys. Even if you go to the same school and same classroom, your life in the way in which you consume things or the friends you make is also different. All these things are ignored because people just assume by 25 you are still going to be able to achieve all those things that the other 25-year-olds is able to live. That means to say you live by the expectation that is set. You don't break those norms, and people get even worse mental health in their world. Notice in our world, what is the difference? Notice that even in status quo, there's this system where upon graduation, you are still hired by the amount of experience you have. This is like very ridiculous, but still has no change, right? Like how do graduates even have experience when they just graduated? We change it in our world. We change that even the employment factor because like we think that you should be literally like hired for your merit and not the entire experience you give individuals. So in ops world, you have unfair employment towards new graduates. Your students still suffer even when they get out of school. In our world, because you change the way the narratives in status quo, is like you get better and fairer employment because you're literally judged by the merits you're able to provide to the company and not just the experience which is based on the age. But second, notice how employers also place false assumptions on employees because they assume like, oh, you're 25 years old. How come you don't know this? You're supposed to be mature enough. We break that norm as well, right? Because we now tell employers that different people have different capacities. If you want to judge them on an objective scale, which is also based on something that's proven within their examinations. Hence why you need to change it to like within their abilities and intelligence. No, the impact is simple in CG. We break norms and we have actual quality people entering into the job market, people who actually finished school because they understood what school taught them and not random people who just moved on because of their age. But second, people actually hire based on their ability, actual ability, and there are fair set of expectations that are placed upon them. So I'll go on and take a POI from CO.
So on your extension of employees, why do you not contend that university exists and that basically destroys everything your case stands for?
Universities literally like help individuals by their ability. Like if you don't pass your year this year, you can still reseat. There's no real age limit to when you can. Like we are pushing for universities because universities stand for that case. I don't get the POI. Going to my second part, then I want to hear responses towards like OO, right? What's best for students in the change of norms? Like 17-year-olds, like we set a new narrative. We have better accountability because even if you are like a 70-year-old and you fail to do like 12-year-old maths, you're not pressured into doing that subject because you're better acceptance of the diversity and the differences among students. And even if, let's say, there's less pressure into doing that subject, you are able to explore into different streams and not be stuck in that one stream just because your other people on the same age are able to do it. That means to say you're an opt-out mechanism. It's easy for you to switch and explore other worlds. In opt school, you're stuck because in your age, you're just like, because the age, you're just stuck there. Why this, and also, why do you get better social interaction? I'm going to flip this as well. Students in school already vary in ages. I don't see why it's an issue, but we get better interaction among seniors and juniors. How do we solve this? Because by just mixing the age, you have the ability to respect individuals by the quality and not the age. But secondly, we get more meaningful discourse because there's less leverage of like seniority and juniority just by your age limit, right? So there's no superior and inferior complex in having the conversation. But finally, you're more comfortable in getting, you won't get bullied and exploited because like you already have friends the same age who might also defend you and protect you. For all those reasons, nothing for us to propose.
All right, thank you for that fine speech. Now to invite the member of OP.
So far, this debate has ignored the reality that these are students from different students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and this will impact them in a way that entrenches discrimination against them because it will segregate them and destroy their options upon graduation. So there'll just be one big push in this extension, that being that this entrenches discrimination. First, let's start on framing. How do cognitive tests actually work? We just think that they don't test your understanding of the content that you're about to learn, but they test like basically your base level of cognitive ability. That usually looks like your pattern understanding, your understanding of language and things like that, but not specific to any content within your syllabus. And we think that this reveals several issues within these cognitive tests. First, we think that these tests can be gamed the same way any IQ test can be gamed. That means that having access to greater amount of resources means that you'll be able to perform in these tests better because you can be able to practice for them. You can just, look at a bunch of patterns all day. Your parents can buy a lot of practice tests for you and you can excel in them. So that just shows that, first of all, this will prioritize people who are from a higher socioeconomic background. Secondly, we just think that language tests, that ones that test your linguistic ability, can, be skewed towards a way that favors a certain type of cultural understanding, or you think this would generally skew towards a Eurocentric cultural understanding. That looks like your understanding of idioms, maybe phrases that are commonly said within the English language. Maybe English is not your first language. Maybe you speak, maybe you speak AAVE, and as a consequence, you end up performing poorly in this test. That just shows you that people from other cultural backgrounds will be heavily discriminated at this from this. And so we just think that as a consequence, the people who will be in the cognitively high classes and the more competent classes will predominantly be people who are white, who are rich. And we think this is deeply harmful in several ways. Because first of all, we just think that they have access towards teaching. OG tells you that you're able to tailor your classes to the level of understanding of your students. And as a consequence, no one gets left no one gets left behind. But we think that this was flawed for several reasons, because first of all, you just never expose these people to difficult subjects, and it's not based on an actual good read of their cognitive understanding. It's based on a test that skewed that is inherently racist, that is inherently classist, and as a consequence, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds just never get access to high concept ideas in their classes. Second of all, they're more likely to be belittled in their studies. That is to say that like teachers won't treat them the same way they would treat students who have high cognitive, capabilities in their eyes, and this will apply to an entire class. That looks like, them actually not necessarily expecting them to understand, not necessarily pursuing them to understand a concept to the greatest of their ability, because they just think this person has a lower base level of cognition, they're never going to understand this, so they just stop teaching them that content. Thirdly, we just think that there's lower motivation to teach these students, because we think that a large motivating factor for being a teacher usually looks like, you're thinking you're propelling the greatest minds of the next generations and things like that, and actually guiding them and actually bolstering them. We think that in the instance where you're in a class where you have to teach people who have been classified as having lower cognition or like are a bit slow, you just don't have the same motivation in your teachings. You're just a bit more reluctant to actually pay attention to them, and as a consequence, they're left behind. And we think that, this just ends up entrenching discrimination in a way that wouldn't exist otherwise, because these people would, on a comparative, maybe you are disadvantaged, but you happen to be in a class where the teacher maybe deeply cares about that topic, deeply is passionate, and thinks that every single student within that class has capacity for understanding. And so they maybe teach that topic a lot better. They make you invested as a student in that class, and as a consequence, you're more motivated to study, you're more motivated to get well and do well in that subject and excel, when that never exists under their side of the bench, because you've pigeonholed these students into like the idea that they could never understand. I'll take that POI from OG.
These kids will be held back either way, because either way the curriculum will be biased towards the rich. We explained from DPM that at least on our side, when the narrative shifts to being people who are left behind and grouping people with your skill level,
okay, cool. So I
feel less about
understood. Okay, so I don't think that they're going to be left behind either way, because even though the curriculum is biased towards the rich, you don't limit access to that curriculum to only the rich people. What happens in your class is you segregate classes and you say, this class has to learn this information. This class only has to learn easy, basic information. And as a consequence, you severely kill their life outcomes. We think that like a parallel to this could be like, for example, in colonialism, when they would teach certain people in English and another in indigenous language, because they thought that those people could only be laborers and the others were going to be the ones who are actually going to be doing administrative high IQ tasks. We think that that actually is what we do in your system, whereas in our class, they're both in the same class, you both teach them both the same subjects, and maybe it's harder for you to understand that concept as a lower socioeconomic person, but you actually have the opportunity to access it. And we think that that opportunity is what matters in this debate and what wins us this debate. Thirdly, we just think that this has drastic life outcomes for you, because at the point where, like, you know, first of all, it takes you longer to graduate because you've been held back severely. Every single year you're being given this cognitive test that don't actually test your capacity to excel in a subject, but test how well you're doing compared to a Eurocentric standard, and being told that you cannot learn higher level maths because of this, you cannot learn even, like, you know, history because of this, and you have to stick to something incredibly easy. That means that you just graduate when you're incredibly old. And we think that this is usually bad for a lot of students, because that makes it harder for them to end up, you know, getting into university. It makes it harder for them to gain employment and things like that. Second of all, we just think that you graduate with significantly lower qualifications with your peers, because look at the worst case scenario on our side. Maybe you're in an incredibly difficult class. You study as long as you study quite hard in that class and you get a C in that class. I think that that's infinitely better from the vantage point of universities, from the vantage point of employers, because they can see that at least you're competent in an incredibly difficult class, and that comparing that to just getting A's in incredibly easy classes that no employer actually values, mean that that is incredibly difficult. And so we just think that on their side, you simply have less ethnic minorities or lower socioeconomic people making it into university. And we think that this was deeply important because education is just the best way to get out of poverty, to break that poverty cycle. They never get that opportunity on their side. We give them that opportunity. That was so important. Secondly, we just think that academic success is a gateway for breaking racial stereotypes in broader society. And this doesn't even have to be external. It can just be internal. When you're put in a class and you feel like you can succeed in that class as a racial minority, that is the first step towards actually achieving greater things for yourself and for your entire community. That is something that they systemically block these people from accessing, and we think that is morally abhorrent. So why was this the most important contribution in the debate? Firstly, we just think that the OG case first assumed that the system actually works. That is to say that people are correctly grouped in terms of their intelligence. And we told you that this was incredibly wrong because it would be a racist way of grouping these people. And instead, they were enforcing and entrenching segregation and validating racial stereotypes. Secondly, they assume that teachers have equal interest in these students. We tell you that they have less interest if they think you're stupid and there's nothing that can be done for you. Thirdly, they completely miss your graduation outcomes, and as a consequence, never grapple with the long-term applications of this, never been harder to oppose both CO.
All right, thank you for the fine speech. To conclude the case from CG, I'd like to invite the Gov with.
Hello, just want to check if I'm audible and visible.
Yep, you're loud and clear. Floor is yours.
Okay, give me a minute. Can I just a quick minute because I need to rearrange my cluster click, sorry. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, Just because a metric was used in the past doesn't mean or justify that it ought to be used in the future. The problem of which is already prevalent in this debate is that age is not really a very good metric into which you determine how good a student is or whether or not a student should necessarily move on. Because like there are also like many reasons that was given by my speaker before me. But moving on, right, what I'm going to do in this debate is simple. I'll clear this debate out with with a few things. First, clarifications. Then I'll move on to the 3 necessary questions to solve this debate. First, let's go into clarifications. Few clarifications coming from my side towards side opposition as a whole. Usually, CO was quite derivative of OO, so by tackling this, we necessarily tackle both benches. First, on the idea of bullying that necessarily happens in this debate. Understand that bullying also happens in status quo where the divides between students are happening because of ages, because of many other factors, maybe because of like other like financial factors or whatever, or B, just because maybe the person in the same age is just bigger than you and you get bullied. So these are reasons into which like bullying is not necessarily mutually exclusive harm. It exists under both sides of the spectrum. Side opposition proves this, like trying to say all this harm necessarily exists, but not necessarily saying why it doesn't necessarily happen on that harm. I don't necessarily see why, if we have the burden to necessarily disprove this, they say it's at most a wash. Second, on the idea of predatory relationships, like how necessarily 13-year-olds are going to date like 17-year-olds or whatever, we tell you that this also necessarily happens. It's not mutually exclusive also. People in high school, like Form 1s, are still necessarily exposed to Form 5 seniors. You are still also able to be an exposed victim towards this. And there are also other mitigating factors to necessarily overcome this, by your structural like reasons, for example, in your school, your teachers, whatever, or your parents, or just any other government body that protects you. We don't necessarily see why this is necessarily harm. Third, the bigger harm about like how child geniuses are going to be more sadder under our side of the house, right? We tell you, hey, let's flip this. Child geniuses are going to be more happier under our side because now they're going to be grouped with like-minded individuals who can necessarily understand them better. So this looks like under our side, we give the propensity or the capacity for these like-minded individuals who are these child geniuses to be able to form their own support group structures within your high schools and primary schools, because now they're not necessarily like what do you call it, isolated or segregated from them, because they necessarily just can't relate to them based on however like thinking process they are. Or maybe you're doing like maths when you're like when you're the age of standard 1, but people just can't even understand maths, right? Now you're able to better have more capacity to necessarily form connections with like-minded individuals and whatever. And also there was also, I call it like how suddenly there was also this random argument thrown about like how school shooting will happen and parents are gonna fear your school shooting. That's not really a problem with the division of students in whatever category, but it's more of a division of like necessarily how like bad like the America's like arms necessary policies are. We can necessarily tackle that other and any other ways. We don't necessarily see how it's a very big problem. Secondly, or moving on to the necessary bigger flaw on side opening opposition is the fact in which the second speaker in itself necessarily clarified that there are other alternatives into which why these individuals can opt into once they necessarily realize that they cannot follow up with the current education system. This proves 2 things in general. First, it proves that the second speaker notices there are already structural reasons or structural problems that necessarily exist within the age problem in itself. Because understand that if your ability to necessarily not follow, your only opt-out mechanism, that your structure is so shit that you necessarily need to have alternatives for people to opt out to, means there's a problem in the structures in itself, right? This means by larger extent, they also agree with the principle that it's problematic and necessary we have to change it for the better, which our side proves this. But let's tackle this in more detailed aspect. 1, the accessibility in which you necessarily have towards your neurodivergency studies or whatever like forms of which you can get into this, what they call it, special classes, are very limited in societies in general, right? Because a lot of times people just do not have the understanding or capacity to go to these studies in the first place or necessarily get this doctorate in the first place. But secondly, understand that like how there's also other determining factors like IQ who determines how fast you necessarily learn. And you cannot get a doctor's note to get IQ to necessarily prove that you need special classes, in which some people necessarily do need, right? I do not see why this is a thing. If not, our side plays it better for these people who necessarily needs this divergence, need these special classes. Before I move on, yes, I'll take the POI.
So there aren't enough exceptions to change social norms. Even OG admits that the average student will probably be in the same class on either side. So a 9-year-old in calculus is rare. How does that change the social norms, which is what you're fighting for on CG?
Okay, it changes social norms because we recognize that these people necessarily do exist, and we can change our structures to necessarily ask them to accommodate them rather than them accommodating to our ages, like whatever study groups and every structure we have. We solve that. Second, let's move on to necessary other things that are coming out first. Necessarily, rich people learn better. Okay, maybe rich people, that's already wrong to a certain extent because there's all the other factors, not really necessarily true. But let's tackle this in a more. We tell you why our say necessarily better. Even if let's do buy in the case, which is very problematic, that rich people do learn better. We tell it's better under our side because now you divide these individuals up. That means now you can better allocate or better give necessary education resources to the people who necessarily cannot keep up. If not, if they're in the same categories, you're gonna force them to necessarily just play a constant game of catch up, which is unethical, unmoral in the first place. We also solved that on our side. And also like how unis was part of the debate. I think uni wasn't part of the debate. Unis necessarily form into our what government tries to prove. I don't see why in. Okay, moving on. The first question is this debate to necessarily solve this. I think a large contention on the side opposition is the question on whether or not humans can necessarily socialize or how do humans socialize, because they keep on telling, oh, they cannot socialize with people who are just older than them. We tell you this is not necessarily true because there are other factors into relatability that encompasses relatability just outside of age. First, hobbies. Second, personal experiences. Three, maybe just the like-mindedness of how you necessarily think in the first place, right? I can tell you, right, I can better necessarily relate to the seniors in my debate club, but like even if they're 2 years, 3 years, 5 years older than me, but then some random person in the same classroom, it's like, yeah, the only reason we are in the same classroom is because we're the age. You think differently, we are just different individuals in general. We tell you that there is capacity for them to necessarily form socialize or have somewhat of a meaningful lifetime. But secondly, but even if it does, you cannot socialize. We tell you, hey, if you can't socialize in the school, you can socialize elsewhere, outside your playground, whatever, with people that maybe you feel better than you want with age, whatever. We do not see why school is necessarily the only way for you to socialize or whatever, harms mitigated or taken down. But second question, or more importantly, why society will necessarily change, and why is this necessarily important, and why is this necessary debate winning? First, we provide to you, but the speaker before you necessarily provide to you. Society has a very big problem, not just the age problem, but also the employment sector in general. This means by structural reforms needs to necessarily happen, and it will necessarily happen. Like, how will this necessarily happen? First, parents will understand, like what my speaker told you before, parents will understand more, they can better accommodate whatever they teach or however they teach to better suit their either gifted or like lesser like basically less unfortunate children or whatever. This means you will form more conducive teaching environments for better family environments for your parents and your child. Second, also your seniors also respect you better capacity because now you are also given by intelligence or whatever. But three, your employers necessarily now legitimizes your whatever graduations you have after high school. Because notice, high school graduates also do work, and this legitimacy is necessarily important because it gives them necessary employments. Okay, so why is this necessarily important, and why we necessarily win this debate in general? First, we provided the necessary ways to necessarily break norms. And why is breaking norm important? By utilitarian standpoints, it gives most benefit to most amount of people, not just your students, but all walks of life. With that, now we're proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that fine speech. To conclude round one's debate and CO's case, I'd like to invite the output.
Oh.
CO, you there?
Yeah, sorry. I'm just organizing paper. Give me one moment here. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Yep, cool.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. When you grow up in a low SES community or from a racially discriminated against population where you're structurally oppressed in the forms of not having access to easily affordable or easy access kindergarten, not having your parents around you all the time to read you stories, which is shown to improve your IQ and your capacity to understand language and engage with tests, you are always going to be left behind in a society where your entire education, your one prospect and chance of breaking structural barriers that consistently oppress you based on your class, based on your race, was always going to be a significant harm, was always going to be far worse in a government world where exactly those types of tests which continue to oppress you to this day were used to keep you trapped in more disadvantageous classes. This was the main problem government bench had. This was not addressed by our opening. This was the unique point in the debate where we entered at closing and comfortably won for a few reasons. Firstly, we explained to you why an education system which inherently requires classes and your your degree of or your quality of education decided on the basis of a standardized test, which inherently was always going to be oppressive against you, was probably a completely harmful thing that existed on government's world when you discuss and push this huge principle of opening, for example, in the form of equitability. Why is it equitable for a low SES, for the stupid class to be comprised of low SES people or people of a discriminated background? Why was it okay for them to have like these huge historical and structural reasons surrounding them because of things like colonialism, just have them trap them in these lower groups? This is particularly damaging for an government case where they try and just explain to you, oh, but it's good for these kids because they can just do better. We literally explain to you why huge classes of children cannot just do better, and that the reason is because of standardized tests, because of the way they implemented, and the fact of the types of requirements that are placed on them. Because of this, it necessarily made it quite difficult for a government bench ever to explain to you why they were able to capture these groups of people without literally just conceding the fact, oh, we're just going to dump them all in the same class and exclude them and leave them behind because only the successful progress. They never engage with it. In fact, they try a really strange thing at WIP to just say, oh, derivative, unclear why our case on discrimination, and explaining the literal structural reasons behind why IQ tests are discriminatory and always return results that suggest, for example, African Americans are just somehow stupider than a white person. Like, unclear why that was like derivative of something you didn't need to respond to. Basically concede the point. So probably explains why our extension stands in the debate, probably explains why it's a huge harm that probably outweighs anything that any other bench can give to you, because we just explained this hugely oppressed, hugely vulnerable group is just going to be exploited more and harmed more, whatever happens in government bench. At least, even if there are harms that exist in our world, they are at least part of these classes. They're at least able to be participating in, classes with their peers, bursting bubbles, being able to have access to at least teachers that actually care. At least they're not being isolated or clumped together in the same class, which is always going to be quite harmful to them as an individual. Three things then, in terms of the responses. Firstly, just dealing with the strange thing we get from closing gov in the form of changing pressures, then on equitability, finally on efficiency. Firstly, on changing pressures, government closing gov try and say, oh, it's okay, because instead you're just going to be employed based on merit, therefore things will be completely fine in school, and they try and disregard the POI around universities. I think that was quite a weak effort on them on that point by saying universities aren't part of this, because when they try and tell you about employment, I think if you're getting employed at almost any institution in the upper, like once you've graduated, it's because you've finished high school, you've got the grades to go to university, from university, you've been employed. Obviously then, merit already exists in status quo. But the unique thing that exists in their side of the world is, in fact, they hugely increase the types of pressures that exist. Because we explained to you at Alexis that actually your quality of graduation, the quality of your grade is significantly worse in their side of the house when you're graduating from the dumb class versus graduating from the smart class. That was always going to disadvantage you as an individual. It was always going to increase the pressure on you. They then just try and say, oh, but employers are just going to hire you not because of just discriminate against you in the group because they assume because of your age you should be able to deal with it. I think again kind of misunderstands how employers hire. Obviously, they take into account things like, are you a good fit for their culture? Things like that. Very strange push. You don't change any social norm. In fact, you probably make it worse because the quality of the type of graduate you get is smart class versus dumb class. Very unclear why that was important in the debate. Moving on to equitability, which is opening gov's push. They say two primary things. One, that it's arbitrary for two reasons. One, weaker students are left behind. Two, advanced kids suffer. Three responses to why weaker students aren't left behind. Firstly, teachers just aim for a standardization and they have to try and lift up the student that fails to meet the standard is obviously left behind, which means you just access things in the status quo that already exist, which means supplementary classes. Secondly, it's just unclear why this standardization inherently just is harmful to, or is inherently arbitrary, particularly when it captures the majority and tries to make it easier for you to identify who is raised up. Finally, it's probably just good for you if you're a weaker student to be surrounded by your peers. It's a lot easier for me as a weaker student to ask for assistance from my friend who's my same age versus turn around to the person that's 4 years younger than me and ask for assistance. You probably make weaker students feel far more left behind in their side of the world. On advanced kids, just unclear why this is particularly harmful. I think smart kids are still kids. Just because you have a higher IQ doesn't mean you don't still enjoy playing Fortnite with people the same age. I think it's probably better for these kids to be around people their own age. Finally then, on backgrounds, before that, a point from opening.
Racial minorities are oppressed either way. On your side, they'll still be left behind. On our side, they don't self-select out of education.
Your side of the house traps them by making them sit tests which are structurally oppressive to them, your side of the house means you have an entire class of people in the dumb class from low SES groups or from a racially discriminated minority, which inherently, I think, suggests to the people in those classes that they are less, that they aren't that important, because you're not going to drag them up. You're inherently isolating them and discriminating against them, which is why we deal with their push on equitability by just explaining to you background. Obviously, in our side of the house, it's not perfect. Kids are left behind, but at least we tell you at Alexis that these children have exposure to higher quality education because they're part of classes where teachers are motivated. We explain to you that they're still able to be part of a social group of people their age. They are not literally isolated and made a unique thing to be called the dumb class. Like, obviously, significantly worse in your side of the house. Even if the harm is on our side, you just lose on that front. You have no equitability, particularly when the people that are graduating from the smart class and getting the better employment opportunities are already from socially privileged backgrounds, already from, socially privileged ethnicities, versus the people graduating from your dumb classes are quite literally these oppressed groups. You have no equitability. On efficiency, we already explained to you at Alexis why it's A, just deeply unclear why you're able to cater to these students better, but B, why it's deeply unclear why you have teachers who are more motivated. Finally, I would just add, it's probably more likely that you have less efficiency when teachers are trying to create curriculums that are trying to cater towards every age group possible in that group. Therefore, deeply unclear where government gets ahead. You should believe that discrimination is important. You should believe for these reasons that closing wins.
Right. That concludes round one. Now all four houses can virtually cross the floor, shake hand, while me and my panel will I think we'll deliberate our OA in the Discord room. Is that fine?
Yep, that's fine.
All right, let's go.
Thanks for everyone.
Yeah, thanks for the debate.
Around everyone. Good luck.
Thank you.